afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We heartily welcome you to our next episode of Diplomacy, Your Questions, Our Answers. Today, our appreciated guest is Mrs. Gudrun Harrer. She is well known as senior editor of the daily Der Standard, and she is as well known as lecturer at the University of Vienna and the Vienna School of International Studies.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bujak. I'm very happy to be here. Good afternoon, dear friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, I would prefer to meet you the good old way, but we are getting used to all of this. Let me share some thoughts about the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, in the middle of a new crisis. I want to speak not so much about COVID-19 in the Middle East, but about the Middle East and COVID-19. But first, some remarks regarding the disease. Following the corona developments in the MENA region, we face the same problems as everywhere else. There is few information available about methodology of data collection. There is often a lack of transparency. And in many cases, there is simply, we are faced with health systems which cannot handle neither the disease nor the statistics. Some areas are covered quite well, others not at all. And I don't have to explain to you what the pandemics means for vulnerable populations in conflict zones, especially in Yemen, Syria, Libya, and others. I apologize in advance if I perhaps will not be able to answer your questions regarding COVID situations in single countries. Even if I had the numbers, I could not read them properly. I am not an expert. Let me remind you that there has been already an experience with the coronavirus, especially in the Persian Gulf region, the MERS crisis, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or also called camel flu. The first outbreak was 2012, another one 2015. You will find, if you are interested, you will find a fact sheet at the WHO site. By the way, a vaccine has never arrived. Of course, numbers of that time were not comparable with what is happening now. But I think generally there was more awareness in that region that such a thing could happen at all. The first massive actual COVID-19 outbreak in the region happened in Iran. Other first cases were on the other side of the Persian Gulf, on the Arab side. In Saudi Arabia, for example, it was a rather slow start. I remember that at the beginning of March, a group of young Saudi diplomats were attending a special course just here in the Diplomatic Academy. And we were already starting to shut down Austria when they left to a fairly unaffected Saudi Arabia at that time. However, since then, the situation has changed. Saudi Arabia has had a shutdown and already a cautious reopening at Eid after Ramadan. And now, nevertheless, we see a new rise. More than 3,000 new cases each on Sunday and also on Saturday, I think, a population of 30 million. So obviously, however, the death rate remains low as far as we know. Also, Iraq last week registered the biggest 24-hour increase since the beginning of the crisis in February, according to new figures from the Ministry of Health. Almost under 800 cases a day, the most in Baghdad. Iran has been one of the most affected countries in the Middle East, with a discussion about the reliability of the official death toll numbers of 8,000. And again, last week, the numbers were rising for the next time, with more than 3,000 new detected infections daily. In Iran, it seems the alarm had not been sounded early enough. Also, it seems because of the legislative elections on February 21 And you might know some quite well-known public figures, politicians even died. However, in general, my impression was that most MENA countries reacted rather pragmatically and quickly. It was certainly helpful that health measures taken by authorities are clearly covered by what Islam says on that matter, at least mainstream Islam. Of course, there are radicals everywhere in the world. And there is also historical experience. We know about several closures of Mecca and Medina during the 19th century, when railways and steamships multiplied the numbers of travelers and pilgrims, and mass epidemics, for example, cholera, was on the rise. 1918, the Arabian Peninsula was hit hard by the Spanish flu. The year is even remembered as the year of mercy, or also the year of fever, which is very telling. For Saudi Arabia, infectious diseases are one of the problems they are having in mind always when they work on their emergency planning for the pilgrimage. In March, Saudi Arabia reacted very quickly by stopping Umrah. This is the pilgrimage which can be done all year round. And it is yet to be seen what they decide for the big pilgrimage, the Hajj, which would be due or is due at the end of July. Why am I stressing this pragmatic approach? I don't have empirical evidence for it, but my impression is that we in the so-called West have at least as many unanswered questions, insecurities, and also absurd conspiracy theories on COVID-19 as in the MENA region. Yes, in the beginning, there were the theories that the virus had been created to kill Muslims only, or the exact contrary, that Muslims would be spared and all the others would be killed. But our stories here are not better. And I think it's a good opportunity to question our self-assumption of being the beacon of enlightenment. I have to tell you, perhaps I'm still shattered by the experience of having a plumber yesterday in my house, an autochthon Austrian plumber, and who simply denied the existence of the virus. When I told him that I think it differently also because I'm reading the New York Times and La Repubblica, the Italian newspaper, every day, he really felt confirmed, and that this is why you believe it, no? So, but a totally different question, of course, is if the health emergency in the Middle East were and are misused to impose new restrictions on freedoms, new repression for political purposes. For example, for stopping demonstrations and for expanding control over private lives of people. Again, this is not a singular MENA situation, but of course, in some cases, it might also deepen existing repression in the Middle East. However, in Iraq, for example, during the last days, we have the rise I already mentioned in corona numbers, but we see also a comeback of demonstrations. We see a comeback of demonstrations, by the way, also in Lebanon. In general, we can say that COVID-19 hit the region with several countries, not only in war, but in political turmoil. I remind you that 2019 was even called a second Arab rebellion year, with presidents toppled in two countries, Sudan and Algeria. In Sudan, the whole system fell. We are now in the sensitive transition period. And in Algeria, we have a new president, Abdelmajid Tebboune, and a difficult political situation. We saw demonstrations in many other countries, especially in Lebanon and Iraq, where demonstrators were expressing not only their specific social and economic grievances, but the protests were directed against their entire political class and the ethnic sectarian clientelist system. In both countries, Iraq and Lebanon, there were changes of government. In Lebanon, in comparison, rather quickly with Hassan Diab, the new prime minister, who presented his cabinet in January, in a country at the brink of economic collapse, and it hasn't changed much in this respect. In Iraq, only the third prime minister designate succeeded in putting together a cabinet. His name is Mustafa al-Kadhimi, and he's the first Iraqi head of government since 2005 who is not deeply involved with religious Shia. And I find this very interesting. He's a very interesting person. In all countries, the richest and the poorest, the economic consequences of COVID-19 can be felt. From oil-rich countries, which have to grapple, as you know, with the collapsing oil prices. By the way, also the loss of pilgrimage income for Saudi Arabia is considerable. To those like Egypt, who suffer a breakdown of tourism, or Yemen, where people were threatened of famine already before the emergence of Corona. We are still in the middle of the crisis, and we are far from being able to estimate the consequences, which most certainly will have a political side too. Especially China will not be idle, while the USA and Europe are busy with themselves. Well, I should not talk too long, therefore let me present in note form some topics which we will have to deal with in the future. And you will also see that in most cases we are facing with regional questions, if not global questions, involving more than one country or actor. I start with Iran, a story with many aspects and several proxy battlefields, real and political ones, involves United States, Arab Gulf states, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, a huge complex. After the escalation of the killing of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani by the United States in Baghdad in January, the situation had been calmed down a little bit, perhaps also due to Corona. And the agreement on Prime Minister al-Kadhimi in Iraq is an example for that de-escalation between United States and Iran, because it needs always a compromise of both. But there is no real solid positive political development. In Iraq, the question of militias which are loyal to Iran remains unresolved. I don't even start with the situation in Syria and in Yemen. Fighting is going on in Yemen. And additionally, a huge sword of Damocles is hanging over us. The future of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal with Iran. You might have heard that the US is ending the waivers. This is the exemptions of US sanctions for countries and firms which cooperate with Iran under the JCPOA framework. There are new tensions between Iran and the IAEA over inspections. So all that together could mean the end of the nuclear deal, and no one knows what could follow. Next question, Israel-Palestine. This was an issue which had almost disappeared, at least from the media during the last years. There was no talk about the future of the Palestinians and the West Bank. It changed with US President Donald Trump's Middle East plan. It's back on the table now. And this plan would allow Israel, as you certainly know, to annex the Jordan Valley and the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. The big question now is, will he, Benjamin Netanyahu, do it or will he not do it, starting in July? And what will be the consequences? For example, today, the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas is in Israel. He's one of the many who tried to talk Netanyahu out of it. But also the Palestinian political reaction is a big headache. What do they really mean if they say they will not stick to the Oslo Accords anymore in the future? I mean, are they giving up their self-administration? Of course, they don't. It's hard to clarify for them. How will the Arab countries react? Some of them developed a very close security cooperation with Israel during the last years. The topic of Iran brought them together. Will they be able to continue this cooperation? Will they leave the issue Palestine once more to Iran? What about Jordan? Is its stability in danger? So many questions. And of course, Syria. I don't even start to list all the salient points here. For example, the stalled constitutional or, I mean, political process for post-war Syria. The reconstructions, so there are new US sanctions expected and so on. But let us jump to the completely unresolved situation in the west of Syria, the Idlib province, the last rebel stronghold under Turkish protection, and also the situation on the northern border. It's interesting that because these situations are kind of frozen on the basis of a Russian-Turkish understanding, or I mean, at least compromise for now. I mean, understanding perhaps it's too much, which brings us directly to Libya, where again Turkey and Russia are on different sides of the conflict, but struggling to find a kind of entente, like in Syria, to keep out all the others. There were huge developments during the last days, with Russian supporters, General Haftar, having to give up the battle against Tripoli. But what does it mean for Libya? Will we see a new push, this time political, for reunification of the country? Or will be division cemented by these developments? Haftar, of course, was not only supported by Russia, but also by Egypt, and the new surprising regional player, United Arab Emirates. And on the other hand, we see the main supporter of Fayez al-Sarraj in Tripolis, Turkey and Qatar. And here we are in the middle of the next defining conflict for the MENA region right now, between Muslim Brotherhood supporters and Muslim Brotherhood enemies, which brings us even to the question, who speaks for Islam? And we see this division, this divide in Islam, in political Islam, even in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So you can see, I fear I almost talked too long, and I think I threw more than enough balls in the air. And of course, I'm very much thrilled to discuss with you also other topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hara, for your very interesting presentation. What about the influence of China in the region? You have mentioned Russia, the United States, and so. What about China?
Yes, I mean, I mentioned even China and said China will not be idle while the others are busy with themselves. I mean, we see a slow but growing influence. I mean, it has not started with the COVID-19 crisis, but of course, I mean, China is there, and China is already in Africa, and especially in the Gulf region, there is more and more cooperation. China it gets a little bit complicated, but I want to mention this. China plays also a big role in what we see now between Iran and the United States. I mentioned that the United States finished all the waivers for countries and enterprises working under the JCPOA with Iran for the implementation of JCPOA. Well, China is a very important country, and I'm talking of a very important Chinese company, the CNNC, China National Nuclear Corporation, who is reconstructing what was the heavy water reactor in Iraq. So it's a very, very important point. in this JCPOA. So what will China now do? Will they, just ignore pending US sanctions against such an important company which works in the whole world? Or how will they react? So, my theory even was that, the United States ending the waivers, the decision had not only to do with Iran, but even to stop China, even to anger China. Huh? And it's totally open how they will react. But you see, it's also a confrontation there. Huh?
And do you think that the crisis, which is enforced by Corona, will be more problematic in the internal relations, for example, between the different parts of the inhabitants of Lebanon, or will be more problematic in foreign relations?
Well, this is hard to say. I would more or less. I think, first of all, okay, let's try to go step by step. If it means more social and more economic problems within the countries, it means also more possible tensions between the groups. This is obvious, no? But I would not say, in the first moment, in the beginning of the crisis, I even had the impression that regional conflict, regional tensions were decreasing because everybody had to really face the crisis immediately and to grapple with his own problems. No, even the Iran crisis. No, but more. If we move out of the crisis, these problems will come back because they are totally unresolved. Take, for example, the Yemen war. No? There was the attempt of the Saudi side to declare a ceasefire, and they also called it a ceasefire because of Corona crisis reason and so on. It was never accepted by the Houthi rebels. But and the fighting went on, but it's going. It's becoming even more now. So I would say both, but I'm not able to say what will be more internal tensions or regional tensions. The fact is that nothing is resolved, and that no political resolutions. Also, for example, for Libya, and that countries are even poorer than before. So societies are under big stress if people cannot go out and work. Also shutdowns, a second shutdown. Imagine shutting down completely, for example, a town like Cairo or so. Extremely difficult.
And what do you think, for example, about Oman, where we have the change in the head of state, which could also be a fragile situation at the moment, because Oman was a good negotiation between Iran and the other side, for example, for a long time.
Yeah, Oman is a very interesting state, and there are many things going on. Strange things also. From outside, attempted political interventions, I would call it. It's very clear that this transition from Sultan Qaboos, who was guiding the country for 50 years, and he was, especially in the first 30, 40 years, a very integrative person for Oman, is very difficult. The new Sultan Haitham didn't have much chance to gain legitimation because he was not known as a successor. No? And Oman always kept itself out of regional quarrels, not only because they are so excellent diplomats, what they are without doubt, but also because to get into regional question was also considered very dangerous for Oman. I mean, Oman is potentially affected by every crisis, and so they really try to keep out. But I am sure that, for example, on the side of Saudi Arabia, which always wanted to have more integration of the Gulf Cooperation Council, they would hope that this is changing with the new sultan. Huh? And I'm sure that there is also pressure exerted that he will, be willing for more integration in the Gulf Cooperation country. I mean, the Omanis were always, for example, also in the Qatar crisis. I mean, the crisis between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. Tried to stay outside, or always having good relations with Iran. Oman was even the place where the first US-Iranian talks about the nuclear solutions took place in 2013. And it will be extremely difficult in the future for Oman. And also there, I mean, we see the economic problems. I mean, also they have oil and not so much, but if you don't get, I mean, with this oil price, it gets additionally difficult for Oman. So, but I think they are not idle. There are some things which they are doing and trying to reorganize their affairs and their state, because, you know, we have to be honest, the last, I would say, almost 10 years were also lost. I mean, everybody waited for the transition. Everybody knew Sultan Qaboos was very ill and would die, but and nobody wanted to react. Nobody wanted, you know, you have, for example, a very ambitious economic plan, Omani vision. I think it's also 2030, and nothing was done for years. So they are starting now, and they are very good, and they are, by the way, also trying to accelerate this program which they had already, Omanization. I mean, a few advisors from outside in the ministries, and Oman is working in the administration and in normal jobs and so on. So, I mean, I really like this country, and they were always very able, and I'm very optimistic that they will continue to be so.
Mrs. Hara, what do you think are the impacts of the present crisis on religious minorities, like the Christians, the Druze, or the Zoroastrians, for example?
Also, this is a very interesting, very difficult question. I have to say many, I mean, you know, honestly, many things. I mean, if you ask such questions also for other regions in the world, I mean, we are just guessing. I mean, seriously, we should say we don't know. No? But of course, look, we saw extremely difficult years. I mean, starting the last 20 years were difficult for religious minorities. The rise of first Al-Qaeda, then Islamic State. I mean, we are always talking about terrorism in the West, but I mean, we know that normal Muslims were the most victims of this Islamic extremism and jihadism. I thought that the region, when Islamic State was, I mean, defeated, at least territorially, was really fed up with this kind of Islam. And many people also asked themselves, what is happening? Why is our region, are our sects so, I mean, affected by violence and also getting violent? No? So I thought that perhaps we saw new discussions which would be very helpful for an important development for the region. But let's be honest, in times of crisis are never good for minorities, and times of crisis are, I mean, you shouldn't have the romantic idea that the whole nation then sticks together and helps each other and so on. I don't believe in that, unfortunately. No? So also there, I mean, we will see tensions. We saw the tendency of some to say, I already mentioned it, I mean, the virus is coming from outside to kill Muslims, and some paranoid attitudes. But I think, I mean, these minorities, these small religions, as I'd like to call them, I'm thinking of Yazidis, or I mean, even religions which in the conflict were gained a very bad reputation in the West, like for example the Syrian Alawis, no? I mean, they are having a hard time in general already. No? From Saudi Arabia, it's good to see that during the last years, with all the problems, and I don't want to embellish anything, but I am just talking about the religion. They are trying to go back to what they are saying they are going back, but trying to really state that they want a moderate Islam and they have to open it up. But it's hard enough, no? And times of crisis and times of health crisis are never the best time for reform. So don't be over-optimistic.
In some countries, and especially, for example, Saudi Arabia, there were plans for a green revolution, so that there should be an increase in renewable energies. Do you think that will be now slow down this trend, or what is your?
I have to say I'm not at all an expert. I had a very interesting guest. I think it was the last. You know, I'm having Middle East Sure Fix here in the Diplomatic Academy in cooperation with the Orient Society. And my last guest was talking about that. It was in the beginning of March, no? And what he said was also until now we see much talk and not so much happening. Huh? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, perhaps the oil price crisis is even a chance in this respect. No? That more and more these countries understand that, I mean, oil is one-way street for many, many reasons. I mean, for environmental reasons, but also for others. But I mean, look at our countries. I mean, we are talking about using the crisis as opportunity to change, for example, policies regarding international flights and air carriers and so on. But is it really happening? Not so much. I mean, let's be honest, in the moment, everybody would like to wake up in the morning and find everything as it was before in January. No? So also there, I'm not overly optimistic. But I think, I mean, it's a topic and it's there and it's not going away. Also because people, you know, if you look at Iraq, for example, so many problems you see there in the south have to do also with environmental problems. No? If people in Basra get sick in the 10,000s in summer because they don't have clean water and so on. Clean water, big issue. No? So I mean, the problem is here and will not go away, and I hope there will be development. But you know, I didn't think about this before this meeting here. Is the crisis really here to change these things dramatically in the moment? I could not answer that question. As I said, I'm not too optimistic.
We are normally talking about influence of like the United States or China or Russia in the MENA states. What about, for example, for the development of the influence of Saudi Arabia outside the MENA region? For example, Saudi Arabia is supporting the Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. also to enforce the Wahhabite version of the Islam.
I get what you mean. Yes, I mean, you know, also this is a very long story. And as I said, I mean, there is no doubt that Saudi Arabian policy for many years was to gain influence also via certain groups and also to finance a certain Islam and so on. I mean, I would only also remind you that it's not only, it's perhaps not always correct to speak of Saudi Arabia. We also should think of many private charities and so on. There is not always the state behind it. Huh? I think it is, I mean, we tend to forget why this happened. No, I mean, we tend to see it like something which is in the nature of the Saudi state, and Saudi Arabia always wanted to do this and full stop. I think we should look at history. We should look at history, also the Cold War in the Middle East, when Saudi Arabia started to spread its influence, for example, against the overwhelming figure of the Egyptian President Nasser. Nobody said they shouldn't do it. It was welcome. This was first. I mean, Saudi Arabia was a very close partner of the West in the Cold War in the Middle East. This is first, and then don't forget the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Also there, after 79, of course, Saudi Arabia, I mean, intensified these efforts. And the impression is that they want, at least officially, to go back from this. During my short presentation, I mentioned the issue between the split in political Islam between Muslim brothers and Salafi monarchies, which is, I mean, not so much a split in Islam, but also a split in political concepts. No, there's the monarchy, the Arab monarchy at the Gulf, and other republican systems who try to gain Islamic legitimacy from other sources. No? So, I mean, of course, I mean, we are in a real situation of Islamic competition. I mean, who is most influential, or whose Islam is most influential? But my hope is that Saudi Arabia really understood that they don't want to spread and don't need also for themselves the Islam which, I mean, we call Wahhabi, no? Which so I would doubt if we still can say Saudi Arabia has is ambitious to spread Wahhabi Islam in the whole world. I doubt this.
There is in a certain kind of rally between Iran and Saudi Arabia as counterparts concerning an atomic bomb. Who do you think will have it first?
Well, I hope no one. No? I mean, it's also, it's too simple. I would, you know, let's say, okay, if Iran, which had most probably, I mean, a nuclear program with also military aspects, which CIA and other intelligence agencies says stopped in 2003. If Iran goes on the way to have a nuclear weapon, or even to have the possibility to have a nuclear weapon, to have everything in place to have a nuclear weapon, which means technology, which means enough material, I mean, enriched uranium and so on, then also Saudi Arabia will follow suit. They will not do it themselves. They will, they are able to buy technology. But I don't think that we have to really in this moment to say, okay, who of the two countries, which of the two countries will be the first to have a nuclear weapon. I mean, it did not happen. And as I said, I mean, the big competition started in '79. So we are in 2020 and it did not happen. So I hope very much that it will not happen in the future and neither of them will have the atomic bomb.
Coming back to the COVID crisis, what kind of measures have been taken by the different governments in the regions to contain it?
Well, as I told you, I apologized first. I cannot, list all the countries with all their measures. I really don't know. But I mean, there have been very, very strict shutdowns also. I mean, I don't think there has been any country in the region without measures. No, the measures were more or less, similar to ours. Of course, in poorer countries, I mean, look at Yemen, for example. I mean, testing is absolutely, absent. We can only guess what's happening, for example, in the areas where the Houthis are. But even the Houthis, I mean, the rebels, they act as a state, of course, and they govern their areas. And of course, also they had shutdowns and so on. No? But we know, for example, about major outbreaks in Aden, in the city of Aden, where the Houthis are not. But I mean, as I mentioned, I think they were quite quick and pragmatic measures. What's a little bit frightening is that with the end of Ramadan, they started the reopening in many countries. And now we see a rise in cases again. No? I don't want to, in the case of Iran, there was the talk of a second wave. I'm not able to tell you if this is technically correct or what's exactly a second wave. But I mean, shutdowns were everywhere and also quite some strict. No? And as I told you, I mean, these are also countries, many of them who are really used to repress and control their people.
Do you think that the official COVID statistics are reliable in this region?
Well, reliable, I would say they are not, first of all, not very hard to compare. I mean, we have the same problem. It's always how you count. I mean, if people die with COVID or only of COVID. So, but also, I mean, there are certain doubts. I mean, there are doubts from the beginning about the numbers, for example, in Iran. No? But who am I to say, okay, they are lying and this country is lying and this country is not? I mean, I just don't know. But I think we have this problem not only in the Middle East and North Africa, but throughout the whole world. I mean, these are also problems of methodology, how we count and how we compare and how much we test. And let's be honest, I mean, there will be some regions in the Middle East where no test at all arrived. And also, I mean, also regions where it's very hard to find, I mean, where authorities don't publish data. No? We have regions like the Kurdish region in North Iraq, who seem to be quite transparent and publish, but others do not. No? So it's hard to say. No?
In one of our previous diplomacy series episodes, Professor Pondi from Cameroon said that the impact of the COVID crisis concerning Africa was not so strong as, for example, for Europe or Latin America or so. What do you see this in relation to the MENA region?
Look, also, this is a very interesting question. And I'm really so sorry that I'm not your COVID expert. I'm the only person who is not a COVID expert. But my thinking was perhaps that some of these populations, some of these countries would have the advantage of very young populations. That perhaps they have exactly the same number of COVID infected cases, but perhaps a smaller, weaker death toll. No? So I think this possibility is still open, but some reports of the past week say it's not the case, that there are huge problems in Africa and people are infected. Or, for example, if you have some reports about countries where they say, okay, the infections are mainly in the poor workforce coming from outside, I mean foreigners, but also these are not old people. No? Also, these are people, okay, their health situation is perhaps weaker and worse than of the average of the country, and so they are more affected. But their advantage would be they are younger. So also there, I think seriously, we have to talk about this in perhaps a few years' time. Huh?
So, Mrs. Hara, thank you very much for your presentation and the discussion now. And it was we appreciate very much that you were prepared to do one.
Thank you.
So, have a nice afternoon. So, the next episode of Diplomacy, Your Questions, Our Answers, will be on next Monday, next time in French. The title is La COVID-19, un danger pour la démocratie.